The first thing Rosser felt when he awoke was pain. First in his head, and then when he tried to move, his right arm. As he lay still for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts, the smell of dirt and rock slowly wafted into his nostrils. After opening his eyes and pushing off with his left arm to sit up, the former general of King Brock's army winced as he leaned back against the dirt wall just behind him. Rosser looked up. The sun was out now, but even then, where he was, it was still dark somehow. He could see, but darkness seemed to cover this place, both naturally and spiritually, if that made any sense, thought the fallen former general. You are going crazy from the long fall, Landon. Who knows how many times you hit your head on the way down. But you will survive, warrior. You always do, whispered Rosser to himself. Now with his wits about him, the big man started to stand, but an excruciating pain from his ankle dropped him to the dirt once more. My staff. If I can just find the larger piece, I could at least use it to stand, spoke Rosser as he looked around with a steady gaze in the peculiar darkness. After gritting his teeth, he whispered, I will not die like this. This will not be the end of me. After a few seconds of silence, his voice became louder. Not after all that has happened. Landon Rosser closed his eyes. Then his voice rose even higher as he screamed, Not after all I have been through. You are strong. You are resilient. You are angry. Like me. Yes, I like that, came a voice from across the fallen warrior. Landon Rosser opened his eyes quickly and looked around, but all he saw was dirt, rock, and darkness. Rosser squinted his eyes to look harder in the strange chasm. Then he sighed, closed his eyes, and said, Not yet, Landon. It is too early for you to be falling apart down here. If you have survived over 30 years of fighting goblins, dragons, rogue wizards, and even your own people, you will survive a little tumble from a bridge. So you would sacrifice even your own people to get what you want? Now I know our fates have truly been intertwined for this moment, replied the voice again in the strange darkness. The voice was matter-of-fact. No trace of any emotion could be found. Now knowing that he was not alone deep down in the ground, Rosser looked around slower and harder for any trace of the voice. Show yourself, whoever you are, demanded the big man, as his eyes darted left to right. Then, just as he finished saying the sentence, he could just make out what looked like a collection of bones, a skeleton off in the distance. Rosser strained his eyes to their limits. Being a man of war since his youth, he had seen his fair share of death and decay, both on and off the battlefield. However, something was strange about this skeleton. It seemed almost human, but it seemed almost elven and dwarven as well. Then a chill went through Landon Rosser's body as he remembered one of the biggest legends of Denaria. The general had led men against dragons. He had outmaneuvered enemies that had more numbers and better weapons. Landon Rosser had taken down trolls with only a knife and his will. He had even escaped from a dungeon in the Goblin Caverns. That being so, who he now realized was in front of him trumped all of that, and maybe all of those experiences combined. Rosser told himself to keep his voice steady as he opened his mouth to speak. You are, spoke the warrior, but his voice broke when he uttered the next word. Agman. Yes, replied the voice. Agman watched as Rosser looked at the bones in front of him, and then up at the air above them, the mortal's head slowly turning from left to right to get a fix on the spirit that now spoke to him. Though the answer to his question was frightening, the clarification of this mystery strangely put Rosser at ease, if even just for a moment. Then he spoke one of Denaria's most well-known legends. You dared to challenge Elion after he created you. You killed your sister, your only sibling, to take her power, to add it to your own, to rule Denaria alone after your father had left to create other worlds. But he returned. Elion defeated you, but the god of all creation could not destroy you because you had become too powerful in his absence. Yes, seethed Agman as he cut off Rosser. And for my deeds and failure, I was thrown down from his embrace into this world to be forgotten. 1,000 or more years have since passed, and I can still feel my burning body crashing through dirt and rock. This chasm my falling body created, becoming my resting place. Rosser stared straight ahead and laughed to himself. How similar his story was to Agman's. True, he was a mere mortal, and Agman a demigod, but both of them had turned against their rulers and tried to take their power. And though the timeline was different, they both ended up vanished and alive in a hole in the barren wasteland. Landon Rosser leaned his head back against the wall of dirt behind him and laughed at the situation. He had met Agman, one of the first creations of Elion. Along with his noble sister Communis, Agman helped rule the world of Denaria. It wasn't until the people started to love Communis more than him that he had changed. Well, that was what Matthias had told him anyway. Rosser closed his eyes, missing his dead son, the man who died needlessly for a king that acted rashly, bringing the kingdom to war. That war not only killed his only son, but also the only real joy in Landon Rosser's life. The big man nodded his head slowly. That is where he and Agman were different. The demigod had made war over power and jealousy. This mortal had made war for a reckoning, and for the betterment of the kingdom, thought Rosser. "If only you could see this now, Matthias," said Rosser under his breath. Then he shook his head as if to erase the strange moment that was occurring.
"Matthias?" questioned Agman. "Who is Matthias? Your brother, perhaps?"
Rosser sighed. He knew his death was near. He could not stand. If he could not stand, he could not climb. And even if he could, the odds of him climbing out of this deep chasm were slim to none. Speaking about his son could at least comfort him somewhat in this dire situation. "Matthias was my son," replied Rosser into the air. "In a way, he is the reason I am sitting here in your presence."
"Tell me his story, mortal,"
replied Agman. Over the next few minutes, Rosser spoke about how Goblin King Todriador had killed Queen Mariana, how King Brock had acted rashly in invading the Goblin lands. And though King Brock had won the war, Rosser had lost his son on the battlefield. Matthias was for the invasion. He agreed with King Brock that the kingdom could not sit by and do nothing after the vile goblins had killed the queen. Matthias had led one of the first attacks into the enemy's lands, but was killed in the process. What did Matthias know? Lamented Rosser. He was still a young man, filled with idealism and action. I asked Elion to temper his feelings. Then I pleaded with Brock to wait, to plan accordingly. Instead, he attacked the goblin caverns so swiftly and without a proper strategy, continued Rosser. Agman watched as Rosser clenched his fist as he talked, reliving the moment. The demigod could tell that the mortal had relived these moments in his mind countless times. Landon Rosser closed his eyes as his head and arms shook in anger. And I lost my boy because of it. King Brock had to be deposed, not just for the death of my boy, but for his rash actions. I asked Elion to give me strength and wisdom in what to do. I knew I could run the kingdom far better than Brock. My men were more loyal to me than him, and when I added goblins to my force by making a treaty, we fought to take Alberlon, and we would have taken the capital city if it wasn't for the Goblin King's cowardly retreat. Now my men and I are barely alive on this forsaken island. With those final words, Agman became gleeful, now knowing he had the mortal right where he wanted him. Landon Rosser was imbalanced by a mixture of mourning and hubris, and even better, he still wanted revenge. Elion did not give you the justice you deserved, but I can, said Agman. Then his spirit floated over to the big man. Though he couldn't see him, Rosser could feel the demigod's spirit circling above him. Then Agman whispered,
And I will.